Good day. Today I'm going to discuss the latest developments in the Ukrainian crisis to the extent that I can, with the caveat, obviously, that as I'm not a military person, I'm not going to discuss the military strategic matters in any detail. My focus, as always, will be on the diplomacy and also on the sanctions which have been announced by the various Western governments. But before I do, just to remind you again that you can find us on Rumble. You can where sometimes our videos appear also on Rumble's homepage. If you watch one of our videos on Rumble, you can press the red maroon button at the top. That will take you directly to our locals homepage, where you will find a thriving community and where Alex Christoforou and I, my colleague at the Duran, publish lots of exclusive content. All you have to do if you want to find any of our channels, which is to say the Duran, Alexander Mercouris and Alex Christoforou, is type our names into the search bar on Rumble, and that will take you directly to our channels. And of course, you can also go to our local community as well when you watch one of our videos there. Now, to proceed, I am not an expert, as I said, on military matters. I'm not therefore in a position to discuss military matters in any great detail. What I would say, from my own personal perspective, from my own understanding of these matters, which, as I said, is limited, is that it seems to me that the Russian military are in the process of doing two things. The first is that they're gradually encircling and tightening their control in and around Kiev, where it seems, and very much contrary to American pressure, the Ukrainian government is still located. There's some rumors that Zelensky himself has actually moved out of the presidential headquarters or main government buildings in Kiev and is hiding in a bunker somewhere. I'm going to disregard that kind of chatter until there is some corroboration of it. But anyway, the Russians seem to be steadily and incrementally tightening the ring around Kiev. And the other thing that they're doing, and that this seems to me to be perhaps the even more important part of the war, if one can call it a war, is that the Russian military also seem to be gradually and incrementally surrounding the Ukrainian army in the Donbass, which is now also facing strong attacks from the militia in the Donbass, the militia of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, which are very much on the offensive. And as I understand it, the commanders of that militia now predict that they will have recovered all the territory of their regions within a few days. So that, it seems to me, is the main direction of the Russian military operation. I would say that over the course of today, I have had an immensely long discussion, which has included the American Marine officer, ex-Marine officer and intelligence officer, Scott Ritter, who was also one of the staff of General Norman Schwarzkopf in the first military operation against Iraq, the one which took place in 1991. And Scott Ritter has explained that, in fact, the major feature of this Russian operation is that the Russians have gone in very soft, as he's put it. They've been extremely careful up to now to avoid fighting in the cities. They've not attacked civilian infrastructure. They've not even taken steps to disrupt communications. So the result is that the internet across Ukraine is still working, and so is the telephone system, including apparently the mobile phone system. So this is a movement, a steady build-up of movement of Russian troops, but undertaken with the purpose, obviously, of interfering as little as it is practically possible to do when troops move around and the fighting takes place, to try, to the extent that's possible, to avoid interference in the communications, in the everyday life of the country. That isn't, by the way, preventing thousands of people leaving the country, and there's reports that there's large numbers of Ukrainians now crossing into Moldova, especially as they try to escape the fighting, or perhaps what they fear will be the fighting. One further aspect of normality, which is perhaps surprising in the circumstances, is that Russian gas is continuing to transit through the pipelines that crisscross Ukraine. So far, both the Russian and the Ukrainian militaries have taken no step at all to interfere in that movement of gas. And of course, neither have the Russian authorities or Gazprom. So Russian pipeline gas continues to flow through Ukraine to customers in Europe, making for the Russian taxpayer, exchequer, the Russian treasury, large sums of money. I've recently learned that Russia receives around $750 million a day in terms of its earnings from its oil and gas and food trade and all those sort of things. So at the moment, that's not yet been interfered with, and there is no sign that there's any desire on the part of the Russians to disrupt it. So this is a very soft invasion. That was Scott Ritter's point, one which has taken place very gradually, very incrementally, troops moving along the very long distances of Ukraine, gradually encircling important cities like Kharkiv and Kherson and Kiev itself, but with the primary target being the Ukrainian military in the Donbass. And I understand that Putin himself, at a Security Council meeting about which I'm only getting scattered information about, has also suggested that the military in Ukraine take control and sit down with and set up a new government which will begin direct negotiations with the Russians. I wonder whether perhaps some contacts between the Russians and senior military officers within Ukraine's military might be taking place. But of course, that's just a guess. I don't know that that is the case at all. Now, over the course of yesterday and today, there has been the ghost of potential negotiations. President Zelensky of Ukraine made an extraordinarily bitter speech in which he spoke about the extent to which the Western powers have let him and Ukraine down, how they're not prepared to fight for Ukraine. Ukraine's been left to face the Russians all by itself. He also apparently told Putin, or at least he said in the same speech, that he was prepared to sit down with Putin and to negotiate. And the Russians responded immediately by saying that, well, if Zelensky is indeed prepared to negotiate, then they're prepared, if he has something useful to say, to sit down and negotiate with him. And importantly, Zelensky brought up the possibility of Ukraine declaring itself neutral, in other words, committing itself not to join NATO, having now been educated in the extent to which NATO is uninterested in supporting Ukraine, is not prepared to provide any material assistance, any military assistance to Ukraine. So the Russians have said, if you want to do that, we're prepared to talk. We've got our preconditions. We want, obviously, neutrality, but we also have to see that backed by actual concrete moves. These include demilitarization of Ukraine. I don't know what that means. And the cleansing of Ukraine of the far right. I'm going to avoid the use of the word that refers to a particular political movement that had power in Germany in the 1930s and 40s, simply because I always worry sometimes whether that will ring any alarm bells with this particular platform. But anyway, that's what the Russians said. And over the course of the day, the president of Russia, President Putin, briefed President Xi Jinping about all of this. And this has provoked some commentary in parts of the West, which has seen the conversation as, in some way, China distancing itself from Russia, when in fact, as I'm going to discuss in a moment, the truth is in fact the diametric opposite. Now, as I am making this program, the Russian presidential website, Kremlin.ru, is clearly under some sort of attack and has become inaccessible. But we have the Russian readout from Sputnik and of this conversation between Putin and Xi Jinping, and I'm going to read that, and then in a moment I'm going to read the Chinese readout. This is what the Russian readout says. Russian President Vladimir Putin briefed Chinese leader Xi Jinping in a phone call on Friday on reasons for recognizing the independence of the self-proclaimed Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics and on starting a special military operation in Ukraine. The Russian president informed the Chinese leader in detail of the reasons for the decision to recognize the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics and to conduct a special military operation aimed at saving the civilian population from genocide, as well as to ensure the demilitarization and whatever of Ukraine. The Chinese leader, on his part, said that he respects the Russian actions in the Donbass region. Xi Jinping stressed that he respects the actions of the Russian leadership in the current situation. President Putin told Xi Jinping that taking into account the signals received from Kiev, this obviously refers to the speech from Zelensky and Zelensky's apparent willingness to discuss neutrality, he was ready to send a delegation to Minsk for high-level negotiations. And then the Kremlin added that the conversation between Putin and Xi Jinping was constructive and friendly, demonstrated a convergence of policy approaches to the major issues on the international agenda. So the Kremlin has gone out of its way to say that this was a friendly call, and it's a case of Putin briefing Xi Jinping on Russia's willingness to open negotiations based on Zelensky's apparent proposal to discuss the question of neutrality. And the Chinese have, of course, provided their own readout, and I'm going to read it. And I'm going to go directly to the section that deals with Ukraine, because it also discusses various other things like the Olympic Games, which I'm going to skip. The two presidents exchanged, this is the Chinese readout, the two presidents exchanged views with a focus on the current situation in Ukraine. President Putin set forth the historical context of the Ukrainian issue, Russia's special military operation in eastern Ukraine, and its position. He noted that the United States and NATO have long turned a blind eye to Russia's legitimate security concerns and have repeatedly negated their promises to Russia. Their continued military deployment eastward has challenged Russia's strategic red line. He also expressed Russia's willingness to have high-level negotiation with Ukraine. So this is, again, the readout is very careful to set out Russia's concerns, and it does so without comment, but in a way which implies Chinese agreement. And again, this readout makes the same point as the previous readout, that it was the Russians briefing Xi Jinping on Russian willingness to open negotiations with Zelensky, with Ukraine. And then we have the subsequent paragraph. President Xi noted that the dramatic change of the situation in eastern Ukraine recently has attracted a high level of attention from the international community. China determines its position concerning the Ukrainian issue on its own merits. It is important to reject Cold War mentality, take seriously and respect the reasonable security concerns of all countries, and reach a balanced, effective and sustainable European security mechanism through negotiation. That, in a word, is the Russian position too. Xi Jinping is endorsing it, and he says that the situation in Ukraine has arisen essentially because there has some countries, obviously the Western countries, have clung on to the Cold War mentality and are not prepared to take seriously and respect the reasonable security concerns of all countries, by implication, including Russia, and to reach a balanced, effective and sustainable European security mechanism through negotiation. A European security mechanism is implicitly something different from NATO. And then the Chinese readout goes on to say, China supports Russia in resolving the issue through negotiation with Ukraine. China has long held the basic position of respecting all countries' sovereignty and territorial integrity and abiding by the purposes and principles of the UN Charter. China is prepared to work with other members of the international community to promote common, comprehensive, cooperative and sustainable security and to resolutely safeguard the UN-centered international system and the international order underpinned by international law. So China supports Russia's initiative in trying to settle the conflict in Ukraine by negotiation. In other words, the Russians, having decided to talk to the Ukrainians about Zelensky's neutrality proposal, they have China's support in doing that. But again, Xi Jinping, the Chinese, are extremely careful to set out China's basic position about supporting territorial integrity and a system of international relations based on the United Nations Charter, because of course they don't want to say or do anything that could be seized upon by the United States in future discussions in order to enable the United States to probe and make trouble for China in relations with Taiwan and the provinces of Western China, including Tibet, where strong secessionist movements are present. So again, the Chinese are very careful in their choice of words, but the readout uses the word China supports Russia. And it supports Russia, obviously, in negotiations, but these are negotiations which the Russians have proposed. My own view about this conversation between Putin and Xi Jinping is that it was set up by the two governments, not so much in order for the Russians to brief the Chinese. I mean, I think the Russians are probably briefing the Chinese every step of the way, making it clear to the Chinese what they're doing. But in order to provide the Chinese with an opportunity both to set out their general support for Russia over the course of this conflict, but at the same time to be able to restate their long-standing principles in a way that will deflect any American attempt to use the situation in Ukraine to cause trouble for China in the issue over Taiwan and over China's western regions. So I think that this was the purpose of the call, and I think it served it. But the key word again is China supports Russia. And we have as a result, we have, in addition to that call, certain articles which have been appearing in the Chinese media, which are taking a very forthright, very forceful, pro-Russian, anti-Western line. And I'm going to focus again specifically on articles which have appeared in Global Times. And Global Times has an article which says, to important world leaders, Chinese President Xi Jinping and his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin held a crucial phone call on Friday. Chinese analysts believe that the Xi-Putin conversation amid the rapidly escalating Ukraine crisis sent strong signals to the world that the relations and trust between China and Russia is tangible and firm, despite US-led Western attempts to sow discord between them using the crisis. And it also showed the world that as a responsible major power, China is actively pushing for a peaceful settlement of the issue by urging the two sides to sit down and talk, which formed a sharp contrast to the US approach that aims to fan the flames. So that tells us in a word what in a paragraph what the purpose of the conversation was. On the one hand, to show China and Russia form a team that attempts by the Western powers to split them from each other by using the Ukrainian crisis are going to fail, whilst at the same time emphasizing again, showing again that China is a responsible player, that it sticks by its principles, and that it's not giving any room or scope to the United States to raise issues that might be embarrassing for China and against China. So I think that was the purpose of the call. And by the way, it's been accompanied by a ferocious editorial in Global Times, which blames the United States for the entire Ukrainian crisis. And it starts with the words, US's real strategic color of selfishness, hypocrisy revealed in Ukraine crisis. And it goes on to say, since dramatic changes took place in Ukraine, the US, which had repeatedly promised to protect Ukraine at critical moments and continue to add fuel to the fire of the situation, has once again come into the spotlight. Ukrainian President Zelensky, in a video speech, complained that Western countries have abandoned Ukraine and left it to defend itself alone. Some Western netizens even ask, where has the US been which provoked the war and said it stands with Ukraine? And then the editorial goes on to say, however, has the United States really disappeared? On the contrary, it is quite busy gaining more strategic interests, that's those words in quotation marks, from the flames of war in Ukraine. The latest remarks by the US on the Ukrainian situation, released by the White House, have underlined 2 points. First, turning Russia into pariah on the international stage through sanctions and other measures. Second, NATO has been more united and more determined than ever, and this is good news. As for Ukraine, which Washington uses as a pawn, in addition to reiterating that the US wouldn't send troops there, Washington only simply said it will support the Ukrainian people as they defend their country and will provide humanitarian relief to ease their suffering. Washington has once again displayed its selfishness and hypocrisy to the world. People have seen that after the US pushed Ukraine into the fire, it stood aside, pretending to care about the country and saying, I support you, keep fighting. It is fair to say that the evolution of the situation in Ukraine until today is a geopolitical tragedy. From the very beginning, it's a bitter result of the US's strategic selfishness and short-sightedness. As early as 1998, when the US Senate approved NATO's eastward expansion plan, the late senior US diplomat George Kennan had foreseen today's tragedy. He said this expansion would make the founding fathers of this country turn in their graves. However, the arrogant American elites always think they can profit from crises. For years, the US has incited conflicts, manipulated the situation from offshore, and reaped benefits. It is accustomed to be the one who adds the fuel to the fire without paying any cost. What it wants is to realize its instant interests. The US shows no consideration for the suffering of the locals, pushed into the forefront. When there is a real crisis, the so-called commitments it initially made will only become empty diplomatic rhetoric. Those politicians don't care about the suffering of local people at all, but attempt to attract attention under the guise of humanitarianism. And then there's a discussion about the situation in Afghanistan and what happened there. And then there's talks, then it goes on to say the US often talks about humanity, justice and morality, but what it really does is calculating interests. Washington's strategic selfishness and hypocrisy have been laid bare again and again in international political practices. Reports indicate that at least 37 million people have been displaced in and from Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, the Philippines, Libya and Syria as a direct result of the wars fought by the United States since September 11th, 2001. There is even a saying that wherever the United States intervenes, conflicts, chaos and terrorism will appear. And it then criticizes the particular setup in the United States. It says a country is called a major power not because of how strong its ability to form cliques or realize its own self-interest is. What matters is the responsibility and ability to safeguard international peace. If a country only cares about its own interests, fuels the flames everywhere, and constantly exports chaos to others, no matter how powerful it is inevitable its credibility will go bankrupt and its hegemony will come to an end. For countries and regions that still have fantasies or act as pawns of the US, the Ukraine crisis is a good reminder. A partner who announces good news when you are in difficulties is untrustworthy. The key sentence here is this one. A country is called a major power not because of how strong its ability to form cliques or to realize its own interests is. What matters is its responsibility and ability to safeguard international peace. If a country only cares about its own interests, fuels the flames everywhere, and constantly exports chaos to others, no matter how powerful it is inevitable its credibility will go bankrupt and its hegemony will come to an end. And this explains the context of those discussions between Putin and Xi Jinping. China, as the country which presents the main alternative in the international system to the United States, which is looking soon to replace the United States as the world's biggest economy. In purchasing power parity terms, it is that already, which is forging a new international system, both in political and financial terms, is saying that whereas the United States creates conflicts and wars, China promotes peace. And you may or may not agree with that, but that explains the care with which Xi Jinping and the Chinese say that in the Ukraine crisis, they want the matter to be settled by peace and by negotiations, even if I suspect they don't actually think it's going to happen. And by the way, for the record, nor do I, because shortly after the news that the Russians were prepared to send a delegation to Minsk to negotiate with the Ukrainians, came the news that the Ukrainians firstly were prepared to send their own delegation, but not to Minsk, but to Warsaw, a venue which the Russians, I suspect, would consider unacceptable anyway, as a scene for negotiation. And then the Ukrainians seem to have called the whole idea of negotiations off. The Russians are complaining that there's been no word from Kiev since that offer of negotiations was made. I suspect that what we heard with that offer, that apparent offer from Zelensky for negotiations about neutrality, was never real. Rather, it was intended, it's another example of Zelensky, obviously under extreme stress, going completely off message, talking about negotiations, floating ideas of neutrality, which he hadn't worked out with his American sponsors, and being called back into line by his American sponsors and by the hardliners who surround him in Kiev, who are, to say it straightforwardly, uninterested in negotiations, but who perhaps are still hoping in some way that this situation can be made to work out in their own favour. Anyway, that's, I hope, an explanation of the Chinese position. Let's now turn to that other topic, which we've been hearing and reading so much about over the last few hours, and this is all this talk about sanctions. And the United States and Britain unveiled their sanctions. The European Union is likely to do so very shortly, but the sanctions are very much along the lines of what we've been hearing about over many weeks. Certain sanctions against Russian banks which for the greater part have already been sanctioned, certain sanctions against certain Russian individuals in the power elite, sanctions that are not going to affect them very much anyway, and restrictions on high technology items which the Russians say they can replace, and which I'm sure they can replace. And one of the most crass comments of all, I was staggered when I saw it, came from the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, who said that one of the sanctions, one of the technologies that's going to be prohibited, banned for export sale to Russia, is technology to refine crude oil. And I have to say that it shows again, to my mind, the total detachment from reality, or perhaps the lack of knowledge of Russia that some of these Western officials and political leaders appear to have. The idea that Russia cannot develop the necessary technology to refine oil is bizarre. What has undermined completely any idea or theory or concept of the sanctions is that the United States and the Europeans and the British have apparently decided to exclude from the sanctions anything that would interrupt Russian energy flows or food exports or exports by Russia of critical commodities, so that Russian export earnings will, to all intents and purposes, be completely unaffected by these sanctions. And given that that is so, these sanctions are not going to have any significant effect. In fact, Joe Biden himself, in his speech, and German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, to an even greater degree, blurted out the truth, which is that these sanctions, at least in the short term, are not going to make any difference. They are supposed, allegedly, to be effective over the medium and long term. The reality is the contrary. Sanctions which have to take a long time to achieve effect will never achieve any effect. Made against an industrially developed and technologically advanced country like Russia, giving sanctions prohibiting exports of certain technologies will only encourage Russia to produce these same technologies itself. So talking in this way is not going to change anything. It's not going to shift the situation on the ground. It's not going to create any real difference either in Russia's economic situation going forward or affect the political, geopolitical conflict which we see underway. For the record, in the hours after the sanctions announcements in Washington and London, the ruble strengthened and the Russian stock market rose. I don't particularly place much particular weight on these indicators in this kind of conflict period. They're inevitably going to be susceptible to gyrations. But clearly, market actors in the Russian market were not particularly impressed by this sanctions announcement or dismayed by it. Anyway, going forward, I will say this. There's an actually extremely good article about sanctions in the Daily Telegraph by Ambrose Evans Pritchard, a person who I often cite and often agree with, though I want to stress I don't agree with him always. This is a good article, however, and it comes from one of the very few commentators who's actually considered the sanctions question properly. And he now says that sanctions aren't going to work, and the article reads as follows. Greater Russia is now a full-spectrum commodity superpower, less vulnerable to sanctions than Europe itself. The West's pain threshold is about to be tested. Fortress Russia will endure this contest of self-reliance more stoically than Europe. And then he goes on to say, we wake up to the sobering reality that Russia is too pivotal for the international trading system to punish in any meaningful way. It influences or determines everything from bread in the shops to gas for Europe's homes and power plants to supply chains for aerospace and car plants, or soon will do if Kiev falls. Who knew that almost 90% of Europe's imports of rapeseed oil comes from Ukraine, or Spain's Jamon Iberica depends on grain feed from the black earth belt of the Ukrainian steppe. Ukraine turns Putin's neo-Tsarist empire, well, that's Ambrose Evans Pritchard's description, into the Saudi Arabia of food, controlling 30% of global wheat exports and 20% of corn exports. It is not just Brent crude oil that has spiked violently. Aluminium smashed all records on Thursday. Chicago wheat futures have hit $9.32 a bushel, the highest since the hunger riots before the Arab Spring. Do not confuse this with inflation. Rocketing commodity prices are a transfer of wealth to exporters of raw materials. For Europeans at the sharp end, it acts like a tax, leaving less to spend elsewhere. It is deflationary for most of the economy. If it continues for long, we will slide into recession. So while there is brave and condign talk of crippling sanctions against Russia, it is the West's pain threshold that is about to be tested. My presumption is that Fortress Russia will endure this contest of self-reliance more stoically than Europe's skittish elites. And then he goes on to say that the debate in the British Parliament over whether to hit a few more oligarchs or restrict city access for more Russian banks has bordered on parody. Brits talking to Brits in a surreal misunderstanding of raw geopolitiks, as if Putin was going to give up his unrepeatable chance to snatch back Kiev and Rus and shatter the post-Cold War dispensation of Europe because David Lammy, that's a British MP, is vexed by golden visas. Nor does the temporary German suspension of Nord Stream 2 change anything. The pipeline was never going to supply extra gas this decade. The Kremlin's purpose was to reroute the same Siberian gas, switching it from the Ukrainian corridor to the Baltic, depriving Kiev of self-defense leverage. Once Putin controls Ukraine, Nord Stream 2 instantly becomes irrelevant. And then he goes on to say further down in the article, the 36% fall in the MOEX index in Moscow, that's one of Russia's two stock exchanges, means that Western investors with a Russian portfolio through pension funds or ETFs have lost money. It does not mean that Russia is being forced to its knees, as some would have it. Nor does the modest decline of the ruble imply unmanageable economic stress. Russia's exchange rate mechanism is designed to let the currency take the strain, cushioning the internal budget against shocks. Russia is sitting on $635 billion of foreign exchange reserves. It has a national debt of 18% of GDP, one of the lowest in the world. It has a fiscal surplus and does not rely heavily on foreign investors to finance the state. This renders US sanctions against new issuance of sovereign debt bonds a mere nuisance. The Kremlin is enjoying a windfall gain from commodities. Benchmark gas futures contracts for March have hit extreme levels of 120 euros a megawatt hour. Russia is earning $700 million a day from sales of oil to Europe and to the US, which needs heavy Urals crude to replace sulfurous Venezuelan barrels for its refineries. The harsh truth is that Europe would spiral into crisis within weeks if flows of Russian gas were cut off by either side. The short-term loss of revenue for the Kremlin would be a small fraction of Russian gold, euro and dollar reserves. There is no symmetry in this. Whatever the rhetoric, energy business as usual will proceed. And then he discusses the technology blockade. The US and Europe can and will enforce a technology blockade, restricting Russia's access to advanced semiconductor chips, acting in tandem with Taiwan's TSMC and Korea's Samsung. This will hurt, but it will take time. Russia has stockpiles. It has its own producers able to make mid-level chips down to 28 nanometers. I should say, as I understand it, mid-level chips are the ones that are far and away the most widely used in industry. And for the record, I suspect that the Russians already make more advanced chips than the ones discussed. The chips that we know about that the Russians make, and I've discussed this before, are the ones that are made by their private enterprise producers. We know very little about chips, microchips, produced by the Rostec Corporation, which is state-owned and which brings together the Russian military-industrial complex, and which we know has its own semiconductor division. So we mustn't make assumptions about Russian chip capabilities, which we actually know very little about. But then, to continue with what Ambrose Evans-Pritchard has to say, China may be irritated by how far Putin has gone in Ukraine, but it will not join Western sanctions. That's absolutely right. They've already said that they won't do so. India is refusing at the moment to do so as well. So, by the way, is little Georgia, even though Georgia is, of course, a Western ally. Nor will it stop Chinese companies supplying chips to Russia through deniable middlemen and plugging some gaps in technology. Putin can reasonably calculate that Western zeal for sustaining this high-tech embargo will wane before it does irreversible damage to Russia. My own view is that it will simply accelerate development of Russia's high-tech sector, with Russia very quickly producing its own chips. It might slow them down for perhaps 1, 2, perhaps 3 years, but not for much more than that. And then Ambrose Evans Pritchard goes on to say, Europe has vetoed expulsion of Russia from the SWIFT nexus of global payments for fear of the systemic blowback into its own banks and because it would have made it hard to pay for Putin's oil, gas, metals and grains, leaving aside the risk that Russia might go all the way up the retaliation ladder. The US itself is ambivalent over shutting down SWIFT because it would accelerate the de-dollarization of global finance. If the US plays its trump card, it risks losing the card. China and Russia already have their payment systems that could be linked for bilateral trade. So one watches the Western pantomime, it's his words, over sanctions with a jaundiced eye, knowing that almost everything being discussed is largely beside the point, that only military strength matters when push comes to a 200,000-man military shove. Now, he said so much, I have very little to add here. I don't think the Russians are fazed by these sanctions at all. The latest word, by the way, is that the European Union is going to impose sanctions on Putin and Lavrov, but not in sanctions which will bar them from travelling to European countries when they're invited there for diplomatic negotiations. What's going to be sanctioned is their wealth, their assets. Except, of course, that despite zealous attempts to find assets which are provably Putin's, the Western powers have never succeeded in doing so. We've had any number of leaks of information from Western banks and financial institutions. There was a big one recently from Credit Suisse. There have been various speculations that some of the individuals mentioned in these leaks might actually be proxies for Putin. No evidence for this proposition has ever come forward, and for the record, I don't believe it's true. And in any event, I don't think Putin or Lavrov are going to be in the slightest bit bothered or impressed or surprised by this sanctions announcement. I suspect all that it will do is leave them amused and probably further convinced that the people they're dealing with in Europe have taken leave of their senses. So there we are. It remains a complex and difficult situation. As I said, I'm not the right person to look to for commentary on the military matters. On the diplomatic front, it's clear that China and Russia are working together. The Russians are being extremely careful to do nothing that will embarrass the Chinese and inconvenience them. The Chinese are making it quite clear that they support Russia and blame the United States for this whole crisis, but being extremely careful at the same time not to give hostages to fortune, or more precisely, hostages to the United States in terms of Chinese announcements, which the Americans might one day spin round and use against China in the difficult conflict that China also has with the US. And as for the sanctions, well, as I said, Ambrose Evans Pritchard has, to all intents and purposes for me, said it all. None of the sanctions which have been announced are going to have any significant effect on the Russian economy, which is immeasurably more diversified and advanced than I think Western politicians seem to realise. And I don't think that these sanctions are going to change anything on the ground in Ukraine. And in the long term, they're going to make both the friendship between China and Russia stronger, and Russia's own economy technologically stronger and more resilient. Well, there we go. It remains a very difficult situation. As I've said in my previous programs, any discussion of war is something I personally find extremely difficult as somebody who has a deep horror of war and indeed of political violence in any form. We're still, I think, very much at the beginning of this crisis. We will see how events develop. I will keep my commentary going. And if you go to Alex Christophorou's channel, you find links under this video. And of course, you can also find us on Locals and Rumble and other platforms. And by the way, we also have our own television service, Duran TV, which you can also find links to. If you go there, you will find that my colleague and friend Alex Christophorou publishes regular updates about the situation in Ukraine, including the unfolding military situation there. So thank you for joining me again today. I look forward to you joining me again soon. Don't forget that you can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar. Don't also forget that you can go to our shop and buy things there. And last but not least, please remember to press the like button to this video and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you again. Look forward to you joining me again soon. See you, I hope, one day on Locals if you're not there already. And have a good day until then.